December 10th, 1815, Westport, Massachusetts. Before dawn breaks over the frozen harbor, a 56-year-old black man stands on the deck of his ship, the Traveler, watching 38 souls prepare to leave America forever. 20 children shiver in the cold. The oldest passenger is 60. The youngest is 6 months old, wrapped tight in her mother's arms against the bitter wind. This man, Paul Cuffee, has just spent $5,000 of his own money, equivalent to over $400,000 today, to fund this journey. He owns a shipping empire worth $20,000, making him the wealthiest black man in America. And he's using every penny of it to do something the history books erased for 200 years. He's leading the first black organized Back to Africa movement in American history. Within 2 years, Paul Cuffee will be dead, his ship scattered, his movement buried, his name erased so thoroughly that when Marcus Garvey tries the exact same thing 100 years later, he has no idea Cuffee even existed. For 2 centuries, they made sure you never heard this story. Until now. By the end of this video, you will know how a black millionaire built a shipping empire in the 1800s, when most black people were still enslaved, and used it to free our people. You will understand why Paul Cuffee succeeded where others failed, and exactly how they buried his story. You will see the documented evidence of how the United States government sabotaged his Back to Africa movement, and you will finally understand the connection between Cuffee's erasure and why you are still fighting for reparations today. This is not ancient history, this is your stolen legacy. If Cuffee's movement had not been destroyed, your family might be living in a thriving African nation right now, instead of fighting systemic racism in America. After this video, you will never see the wealth gap the same way. You will never accept the lie that black people don't build the same way. Because once you know what they stole, once you see what they erased, you cannot unsee it. Your ancestors lived this. Your grandparents survived the aftermath. You carry this legacy in your blood. This is why they don't teach this in schools. Because if you knew, you would demand what was stolen. Let me take you back to January 17th, 1759. Cuttyhunk Island, Massachusetts. A baby boy is born to parents who should never have met in any just world. His father, Kofi Slocum, was stolen from Ghana, enslaved, and brought to Massachusetts in chains. But Kofi did something remarkable. He purchased his freedom. He saved every penny from extra work, from skills he sold, from crops he grew on borrowed land, and he bought himself out of bondage. His wife, Ruth Moses, was Wampanoag, indigenous to this land before colonizers arrived. Their son, born free because his father had won freedom first, was named after his father's African name. Paul Cuffee, though at birth they called him Cuff Slocum, would grow up in a legal limbo that defined the lives of free black people in colonial America. Free on paper, but with no rights, no citizenship, no protection, no future that white society would recognize. Think about what it meant to be a free black child in 1759. Slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. The Revolutionary War had not even started yet. The Declaration of Independence, with its lie that all men are created equal, would not be written for another 17 years. Young Paul Cuffee grew up watching his father work land he could never own, sell goods in markets where he had no legal standing, pay taxes to a government that refused to recognize him as human. And Paul learned. He watched. He understood that legal freedom meant nothing without economic power, without ships, without trade, without wealth that white men could not simply take by changing a law or writing a new policy. So Paul Cuffee taught himself to read, which was dangerous for any black person. He taught himself navigation by watching the stars and studying the coastline. He built his first small boat with his own hands, and he went to sea. By his 20s, Cuffee was already making money in whaling and shipping. Small amounts at first. Dangerous work that white sailors often refused because the profit margins were too thin and the risk of death too high. But Cuffee took those risks. He saved every dollar. He bought a larger boat, then another, and another. He built relationships with Quaker merchants who saw in him something they claimed to believe in, but rarely acted on: that all people were equal before God, that slavery was a sin, that black people deserved the same opportunities as white people. The Quakers gave him credit when banks would not. They traded with him when other merchants refused. And Cuffee built an empire. By 1806, he owned one ship outright. By 1811, he owned multiple vessels, employed both black and white sailors, and had trade routes running from Massachusetts to Europe to Africa. He had done what they said was impossible. A black man in America, born to a formerly enslaved father, had become wealthier than most white men would ever dream of being. But here is where Paul Cuffee's story becomes the story they had to erase. Because wealth was not enough for him, freedom for himself was not enough. He looked around at the America he had built his fortune in, and he saw the truth. That no matter how much money a black person accumulated, no matter how much respect they earned, no matter how much they proved their equality, white supremacy would never accept them as truly free. And he made a decision that changed everything. He would use his wealth not to integrate into white society, but to build a black nation independent of white control entirely. He would take black people back to Africa, not as exiles, not as refugees, but as free people with resources and skills and ships and capital, returning to build something that white supremacy could never touch. And he almost succeeded. The year is 1780. Paul Cuffee is 21 years old, and he does something that most historians skim over or ignore completely, because it reveals too much about his character. He refuses to pay taxes. Now you have heard that phrase before, right? No taxation without representation. That was the rallying cry of the American Revolution. White colonists refusing to pay taxes to Britain because they had no representation in Parliament. But Paul Cuffee and his brother David took that same principle and threw it back in the face of Massachusetts. They said, "We are free men. We pay taxes, but we cannot vote. We have no representation. Therefore, we will not pay." And Massachusetts arrested them, threw them in jail for tax evasion, for rebellion, for daring to use the logic of the American Revolution to demand rights for black people. But here is what they do not teach you. Paul Cuffee won. He and his brother took the case to court, and in 1783, Massachusetts changed its law. Free black men who paid taxes could now vote. Let that sink in for a moment. A 24-year-old black man, son of a formerly enslaved father, forced a state government to recognize black voting rights. 77 years before the 15th Amendment supposedly gave black men the right to vote nationwide. Paul Cuffee had already won that right in Massachusetts by refusing to back down and using the system's own logic against it. This should be in every history book. Every child in America should know this story, but they buried it. Because if you knew that black people fought for and won civil rights in the 1780s, you might start asking uncomfortable questions about why those rights were stripped away and why it took so long to win them back. Now Cuffee had money. He had legal rights in Massachusetts that most black people in America did not have. He could vote, he could own property, he could conduct business. But through the 1790s and 1800s, Cuffee watched as the situation for black people in America grew worse, not better. The slave trade was supposedly abolished in 1808, but slavery itself expanded westward into new territories. Free black people in the North faced increasing violence and discrimination. Laws were passed to restrict where they could live, what jobs they could hold, whether they could testify in court. And Cuffee realized something that would define the rest of his life: that legal freedom in America was a trap. That no matter what rights were granted on paper, white supremacy would always find a way to take them back. That true freedom for black people could only exist outside the reach of American power. And so, in 1808, Paul Cuffee became a Quaker. He joined the Religious Society of Friends, a group that opposed slavery and believed in the equality of all people before God. And through his Quaker connections, he learned about Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was a British colony on the west coast of Africa, established in 1787 as a settlement for formerly enslaved black people freed by the British during the American Revolution. Black loyalists who had fought for Britain in exchange for promises of freedom. Black refugees from Nova Scotia who had fled there after the war. And now, a small but growing community of free black people trying to build lives on African soil. Cuffee heard about this place, and something shifted in his mind. What if black Americans, instead of fighting for scraps of dignity in a country that hated them, simply left? What if they used their skills, their resources, their knowledge, and returned to Africa not as defeated refugees, but as entrepreneurs and builders and leaders? What if they established trade networks between Black America and Black Africa that cut white middlemen out entirely? What if they built wealth that white people could never vote to redistribute, never legislate away, never burn down in a race riot? That vision consumed Paul Cuffee, and in 1810, at the age of 51, he set sail for Sierra Leone to see if his dream was possible. Imagine what that journey meant. Paul Cuffee, a black man born in America, standing on the deck of his own ship, sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, but this time traveling in the opposite direction of the slave trade, not in chains in the hold of a ship, but as the captain, as the owner, as a free man returning to the continent his father had been stolen from. When Cuffee arrived in Freetown, Sierra Leone, in 1811, he found a struggling but determined community. Black people from America, from the Caribbean, from London, all trying to build something new. They had farms, they had small businesses, they had churches and schools, but they lacked capital, they lacked ships to trade with, they lacked connections to markets. And Paul Cuffee saw opportunity. He stayed for months, meeting with community leaders, attending Quaker meetings, studying the land and the economy. And in December 1811, Cuffee helped establish the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone, a cooperative organization designed to promote agriculture, trade, and economic development among the black settlers. It was brilliant. Cuffee would provide ships and trade connections. The settlers would provide goods to export. Together, they would build an economy that enriched black people on both sides of the Atlantic without needing white intermediaries. But here is where the United States government steps in to destroy everything. April 1812. Paul Cuffee returns from Sierra Leone on his ship The Traveler, loaded with goods from Britain and Africa. He sails into the harbor at Rhode Island, expecting to unload, sell his cargo, and begin organizing the emigration movement in earnest. Instead, customs officials seize everything, every barrel, every crate, every piece of cargo. And they inform Cuffee that he has violated the Nonintercourse Act of 1811, a law passed by Congress prohibiting trade with Britain. Cuffee loses over $3,000 in one day, nearly everything he had invested in the Sierra Leone venture. He is on the brink of financial ruin. And this is not an accident. This is not some bureaucratic mistake. This is the United States government using the law as a weapon to stop a black man from building independent economic power. Think about this. Paul Cuffee spent years building relationships in Sierra Leone. He invested his own money. He risked his life crossing the Atlantic. He created a blueprint for black economic self-determination. And the moment he returns with proof that it works, the government seizes his assets. They do not arrest him. They do not charge him with a crime. They just take everything and leave him with nothing. But Paul Cuffee does not run. He does not give up. He does not accept defeat. He does something that no free black man in America had ever done before. He goes to Washington. He gets letters of introduction from Federalist politicians who oppose President Madison's trade policies. And on May 2, 1812, Paul Cuffee walks into the White House and meets with the President of the United States. Let that image sit in your mind for a moment. A black man, born to a formerly enslaved father, in 1812, when slavery is legal and thriving across half the country, walking into the White House, sitting down with President James Madison, and demanding that his property be returned. This is not a minor historical footnote. This is one of the most significant moments in early Black American history, and it has been almost completely erased. The meeting is documented. Madison's secretary recorded it. Historical records confirm it happened. But how many black people today know that Paul Cuffee was the first free black man to meet with a sitting president to discuss a policy issue? How many people know that Madison listened to Cuffee's plan for black emigration to Sierra Leone, asked questions about the colony, and then ordered the Treasury Department to return Cuffee's seized goods? The government gave back what they had stolen, not all of it, not without strings attached, but enough that Cuffee could continue, and Madison sent him away with a warning. War with Britain is coming. No more voyages until it is over. The War of 1812 began 2 months later. For 3 years, Paul Cuffee was stuck. He could not sail to Sierra Leone because British and American ships were attacking each other on the Atlantic. He could not trade with Britain because it was illegal. He could not move forward with his emigration plan because the war made it impossible. But Cuffee did not waste those 3 years. He used them to organize. He traveled up and down the East Coast, meeting with free black communities in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. He preached his vision, that black people would never be truly free in America, that emigration to Africa was not exile or defeat, but reclamation and power, that those who went would not be refugees but pioneers, taking skills and capital and faith to build something new. And people listened. Families signed up, blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, seamstresses, teachers. People with skills who were tired of being treated as less than human in the country they had built with their labor. They wanted out, and Paul Cuffee promised to take them. In Philadelphia, Cuffee worked with James Forten, one of the wealthiest black men in the city, a sailmaker who employed both black and white workers. Forten was initially skeptical. He believed black people should fight for equality in America, not abandon the country. But even Forten had to admit that the fight was not going well, that every gain was met with violent backlash, that legal rights meant nothing when white mobs could burn black neighborhoods without consequence. So Forten gave Cuffee access to Philadelphia's black community, and Cuffee preached in churches, in homes, in meeting halls. He told them about Sierra Leone, about black people governing themselves, about land they could own without fear of white neighbors burning them out, about a future where their children would grow up free, not just legally, but actually, and families signed up. They sold what little they owned. They prepared to leave everything behind for a chance at real freedom. December 10th, 1815. The war is over. Trade is legal again. And Paul Cuffee stands on the deck of the Traveler at Westport, Massachusetts, watching 38 people board his ship. 9 families, 18 adults, 20 children. The oldest is 60 years old. The youngest is 6 months old. They bring everything they own in trunks and bags and boxes. Tools for building, seeds for planting, Bibles and hymnals, everything they need to start over. And Paul Cuffee, now 56 years old, looks at them and knows this is the most important thing he will ever do. He has spent $5,000 of his own money to make this happen. He has not charged them a single cent. He is paying for their passage, for their food, for their supplies, for everything. Because this is not a business venture. This is a mission. This is liberation. The journey takes 2 months. Winter on the Atlantic is brutal. Waves 30 feet high crash over the bow. Storms batter the ship for days. The Traveler is a good ship, 60 feet long, 2 masts, sturdy construction. But it is not large. 38 passengers plus crew in tight quarters for 2 months. Seasickness, cold, fear, children crying in the night, parents wondering if they made the right choice. But Paul Cuffee is there, every day, every night. He steers the ship himself. He teaches the younger men navigation. He holds prayer meetings every morning and evening in the Quaker tradition, sitting in silence, listening for God's voice, praying for safe passage, praying for the future they are sailing toward. And every time doubt creeps in, every time someone asks if they should have stayed in America, Cuffee reminds them, "We are not running away. We are going home." February 3rd, 1816. The Traveler sails into Freetown Harbor, Sierra Leone. The sun rises over the West African coast, and 38 Black Americans stand on the deck, looking at land, African land. For the first time in their lives, they are in a place where being black is not a crime, where they are not the minority, where they are not constantly watching over their shoulders for violence. They are home. The families disembark. And Paul Cuffee does not just drop them off and sail away. He stays for 6 weeks. He helps them purchase land from the Sierra Leone Company, the British organization that administers the colony. He helps them build houses. He connects them with the Friendly Society, the cooperative he helped establish in 1811. He introduces them to other Black American and Caribbean settlers who arrived earlier. He sets up trade agreements so they can sell their crops and goods back to America. He makes sure they have everything they need to succeed. And then he makes them a promise. "I will return every year with more families, with more resources. We are going to build something that lasts." In August 1816, Paul Cuffee sails back to America. He is exhausted. The journey has taken a physical toll. He is 57 years old now, and 2 transatlantic crossings in less than a year have worn him down. But he is energized by what he has accomplished. 38 people are free, truly free. And he has proven that Black-led emigration is possible, that it works, that Black people can return to Africa not as charity cases, but as builders and entrepreneurs. He begins planning the next voyage immediately. He needs funding this time. He has spent most of his personal wealth on the first trip. So he reaches out to wealthy Black leaders in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. He asks for financial support. And this is where everything falls apart. January 1817. Just months after Cuffee returns, a group of white men in Washington, D.C. hold a meeting. They call it the American Colonization Society. The founders include Robert Finley, a white Presbyterian minister, Henry Clay, a congressman and slaveholder from Kentucky, Bushrod Washington, nephew of George Washington and a Supreme Court justice. And their stated goal, written in their founding documents, is to promote the colonization of free Black people to Africa. On the surface, it sounds exactly like what Paul Cuffee has been doing, but the motives are completely opposite. Paul Cuffee wants Black self-determination, Black-led emigration, black economic independence. The American Colonization Society wants black removal. They see free black people as a threat to slavery. Free black people living in the South give enslaved people hope. They prove that black people can thrive without white masters. They create unrest. And so the solution, according to the ACS, is to get rid of free black people entirely. Ship them to Africa, not to liberate them, but to protect slavery. The ACS uses language that sounds like liberation. They talk about giving black people a homeland, about ending racial conflict, about helping black people reach their full potential. But read the actual documents. Read what Henry Clay said. He called free black people a dangerous and useless population. Read what Thomas Jefferson, who supported the ACS, wrote. He said black people and white people could never live together as equals, and that removing free black people would make slavery more secure. This was not an abolition organization. This was a white supremacist organization using the language of freedom to accomplish ethnic cleansing. And the tragedy is that they succeeded in hijacking Paul Cuffee's vision. Because when black communities heard about the ACS, they did not see the difference. They thought all colonization schemes were the same. They thought Paul Cuffee was working with these white supremacists, and they rejected the entire idea. January 25th, 1817. Just 9 days after the ACS is founded, Paul Cuffee receives a letter from James Forten in Philadelphia. Forten writes that he organized a mass meeting of black people at Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. 3,000 people showed up, and they voted almost unanimously to reject colonization. They said they would rather fight for their rights in America than be exiled to Africa by white people who wanted them gone. Forten apologizes to Cuffee. He explains that the ACS has poisoned the well, that black people cannot trust any colonization scheme now because they assume it is a white supremacist plot. And Cuffee is devastated. He has spent years building this movement. He has spent his fortune. He has risked his life. And now his own people are rejecting him because white supremacists stole his idea and twisted it into something evil. Paul Cuffee dies on September 7th, 1817. He is 58 years old. The official cause of death is listed as illness, but there is no detailed record, no autopsy, no investigation. Just a brief note that he died at his home in Westport, Massachusetts, 1 month after receiving Forten's letter. 1 year after proving that black-led emigration could work, at the height of his influence and power, and his dream dies with him. There is no successor. No one steps forward to lead the movement. The African institution, the organization Cuffee founded to coordinate emigration, collapses. The Friendly Society of Sierra Leone struggles without his trade connections and eventually fades. The 38 families he brought to Africa in 1816 are the only ones. There is no second voyage, no third, no movement, just silence and erasure. Here is what they do not tell you in history books. Paul Cuffee's death was convenient, extremely convenient, for the American Colonization Society, for the slave-owning class, for everyone who benefited from keeping black people trapped in America without power. Cuffee was the only person with the wealth, the ships, the connections, and the credibility to lead a true black emigration movement. With him alive, black people had a choice. They could fight for rights in America, or they could leave on their own terms with resources and support. With him dead, the only colonization option was the white-controlled ACS, which black people rightfully rejected. And so black people stayed in America, and slavery expanded. And after slavery ended, Jim Crow took its place, and the cycle of oppression continued. Because the one man who offered an alternative, who proved it could work, was gone. Let me show you how they erased Paul Cuffee from history. In the decades after his death, when historians wrote about the colonization movement, they focused entirely on the American Colonization Society. They wrote about Liberia, the colony the ACS established in 1822. They wrote about the white founders, the white politicians, the white philanthropists. Paul Cuffee's name appeared occasionally, but always as a footnote, a minor figure, someone who dabbled in colonization before the real movement began. They stripped away his leadership. They erased the fact that he was first. They ignored his vision of black self-determination and lumped him in with white supremacist colonization schemes. And slowly, over generations, Paul Cuffee disappeared from the American historical narrative entirely. By the time Marcus Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1914 and launched his own Back to Africa movement, almost no one remembered Paul Cuffee. Garvey had no idea that a black man had done the exact same thing 100 years earlier. He could not learn from Cuffee's successes or his mistakes. He could not build on Cuffee's foundation because that foundation had been erased. And so Garvey made the same mistakes. He trusted the wrong people. He tried to work within systems designed to destroy him. And the United States government crushed him exactly the way they crushed Cuffee. Different tools, same result. Before we go deeper into how they erased Paul Cuffee from the record, there is something important you need to understand. His story is not an isolated miracle. It is part of a pattern that shows up again and again whenever black people, anywhere in the world, try to build independent power. Every time we build, the system attacks. Every time we organize, the system infiltrates. Every time we create alternatives, the system rewrites the story. Paul Cuffee is the opening chapter of a long book, and if you only know his chapter, you will miss how big this really is. So let us jump forward 100 years. The year is 1916. A dark-skinned man from St. Ann Bay, Jamaica, steps off a ship in New York City. His name is Marcus Garvey. He looks around at Harlem, at the crowded tenements, at black people pushed into the poorest housing in a so-called free city, and he recognizes something that Paul Cuffee saw a century earlier. America will never willingly treat black people as equals, so he starts to build. In 1914, he had founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in Jamaica. By the early 1920s, the UNIA has spread across the Caribbean, the United States, and Africa. Millions of members, mass rallies in Harlem, parades down Lenox Avenue with thousands of black men and women dressed in uniforms, marching in formation, carrying red, black, and green flags. Now remember what Paul Cuffee did with ships. He bought vessels. He created trade routes. He believed that whoever controlled the ships controlled the future. Marcus Garvey comes to the same conclusion. In 1919, he launches the Black Star Line, a black-owned shipping company intended to connect black people in America, the Caribbean, and Africa. He raises money from everyday black folks. People buy $5 shares, sometimes with coins saved in coffee cans, because they believe in the idea. They want to own something together. They want to send goods, people, wealth, across the Atlantic under their own flag. No white intermediaries. No white approval. Now hold that image in your mind. Black-owned ships, black capital, black trade across the Atlantic. Ask yourself a simple question. How different is that from what Paul Cuffee did in 1815 with the Traveler and those 38 emigrants to Sierra Leone? The parallels are almost exact. A black leader, a shipping company, a vision of global black unity and economic independence, a desire to build something outside white control. And now ask the next question. What happened to Marcus Garvey? Because the answer is the same pattern that destroyed Paul Cuffee, just with new tools. From the beginning, the United States government saw Garvey as a threat. J. Edgar Hoover, a young lawyer in the Justice Department who would later run federal law enforcement for half a century, targeted Garvey personally. He called him the most dangerous Negro in America. He authorized surveillance, infiltration, and disruption of the UNIA. Agents attended meetings, they read mail, they planted informants, and when they realized they could not defeat Garvey politically, they decided to destroy him legally. They looked for any technical violation they could find, not because they cared about the law, but because they cared about the threat he represented. In 1922, Garvey was indicted on mail fraud charges related to the sale of Black Star Line stock. The details are complex, but the pattern is simple. Use a technicality to destroy a movement. He was convicted in 1923, sentenced to prison, and in 1927, he was deported from the United States. The Black Star Line collapsed. The UNIA splintered. The dream of an organized Back to Africa movement died again. Do you see the rhyme? Paul Cuffee. Government uses trade laws to seize his cargo and choke his movement. Marcus Garvey. Government uses mail fraud laws to imprison him and choke his movement. 2 different centuries, 2 different legal codes, same strategy. Find a law, any law, apply it selectively, and when that does not work, apply it creatively. Because the goal is not justice, the goal is neutralizing a threat. Before Garvey, there were others who tried to build pathways out of American oppression. In the 1850s, a man named Martin Delany, one of the first black graduates of Harvard Medical School, a physician, a writer, and an abolitionist, came to the same conclusion as Cuffee. America would never accept black people as equals. Delany traveled to West Africa in 1859. He negotiated with leaders in what is now Nigeria for land where African Americans could settle. He wrote about the need for black people to control their own destiny on their own land. He planned to lead expeditions. Then the Civil War broke out in 1861. Delany joined the Union Army, became the first black field officer commissioned in that army, a major. The war consumed his time and energy. Afterward, during Reconstruction, he focused on politics in the South. The emigration plan faded. The opportunity closed. In the 1870s and 1880s, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner of the African Methodist Episcopal Church became one of the loudest voices calling for black emigration. He watched Reconstruction collapse. He watched federal troops withdraw from the South in 1877. He watched white terror organizations regain control through violence. He saw black men dragged from polling places, black women abused, black families burned out of their homes, and he concluded that remaining in America was a death sentence. He organized trips to Liberia. He preached that America was a white man's country and that black people should leave. He faced intense backlash, not just from white society, but from black intellectuals who believed in integration. Newspapers attacked him. White politicians labeled him dangerous. His funding dried up. Without ships or capital, his movement never reached the scale he envisioned. By the time Turner died in 1915, his efforts were remembered as controversial, fringe, even reckless, rather than as a continuation of a long tradition of black self-determination that began with Paul Cuffee. Then you have W.E.B. Du Bois, a man most people know only as a civil rights pioneer and co-founder of the NAACP. But Du Bois was also a Pan-Africanist. He believed that the fate of black people in America was tied to the fate of Africa. Starting in 1900, he organized Pan-African Congresses, meetings that brought together black leaders from America, the Caribbean, and Africa. The first was in London in 1900, the second in Paris in 1919, right after World War I. Later meetings took place in Lisbon, Brussels, Manchester. The goals were clear: to demand an end to colonial rule in Africa, to demand rights for black people everywhere, to build a global black political network. How did the system respond? Surveillance, smears, laws. In the United States, Du Bois was monitored by federal agencies for decades. During the Cold War, when he opposed nuclear weapons and supported peace movements, he was charged in 1951 with failing to register as an agent of a foreign principal because he chaired a peace organization that received some foreign support. Think about that. W.E.B. Du Bois, then in his 80s, a scholar, a civil rights leader, accused like a foreign agent because he dared to oppose war and support decolonization. Though he was acquitted, the stress, the legal fees, the public attacks took their toll. In 1961, at age 93, Du Bois accepted an invitation from Ghana's president, Kwame Nkrumah, to move to Ghana and work on an encyclopedia of the African diaspora. He renounced his American citizenship. He died in Accra in 1963, the night before the March on Washington. Paul Cuffee's ships, Martin Delaney's negotiations, Henry McNeill Turner's sermons, Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line, W.E.B. Du Bois's Pan-African Congresses, different men, different eras, same pattern. Anytime black people try to build power across borders, connect the diaspora, create independent economic and political structures, a system designed to maintain white dominance reacts. Laws appear, court cases multiply, surveillance intensifies, movements fracture under pressure. Leaders die in poverty, exile, or under clouds of suspicion. If this were random, you would see some of these movements succeed and others fail. But what you see instead is systematic disruption, repeated, predictable, intentional. Now ask yourself a hard question. What did this pattern cost your family? What did it cost the people you love? Because this is not just about the past. It reaches straight into your bank account, your mortgage, your retirement, your children's future. You live every day in the aftermath of every destroyed movement, every blocked voyage, every sabotaged institution. So let us talk about money. The median white household in the United States today holds around $188,000 in wealth. Home equity, savings, investments, retirement accounts. The median black household holds around $24,000. That is a gap of about 8 times. For every dollar of wealth an average black family has, an average white family has 8. People love to explain this gap with stereotypes. They say black people do not save. They say black people spend on the wrong things. They say black people do not build businesses. They say it is a cultural problem, personal responsibility, individual failure. But when you know the story of Paul Cuffee and the movements that followed him, you see that this gap is not about behavior. It is about theft. Think about that $5,000 Paul Cuffee spent from his own pocket in 1815. That is equivalent to well over $100,000 today. Think about the $20,000 he accumulated in his lifetime, equivalent to at least $400,000 today. That was black wealth generated in the early 19th century, not through crime, not through exploitation, through shipping, trade, honest labor, skill. That money did not just vanish when he died. It went somewhere. His ships were sold. His property was divided. White merchants filled the trade routes he opened. White shipping companies took over the lanes he charted. His business model did not disappear. It was copied, just without him, without his people. Now imagine if the movement he started had grown. 38 people in 1816. Let us be conservative. Suppose he had managed, over 20 or 30 years, to send 1,000 more families to Sierra Leone. Families with skills, blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, merchants. Suppose they had built a strong black-controlled economy on the West African coast, trading with black communities in the United States and the Caribbean. Suppose their children and grandchildren had inherited land, businesses, and trade connections. Suppose some of those families had branched into banking, shipping, manufacturing, the way white families did in New England. What would those lineages look like today? You would have black families with 200 years of intergenerational wealth. Not one house passed down, but entire networks of companies and properties. You would have cousins in Sierra Leone or Liberia sending money back to Philadelphia or Boston when times got hard. You would have safety nets. Instead, the system cut that off at the root. Paul Cuffee dies. His movement dies. The American Colonization Society builds Liberia as a quasi-colony rather than a truly independent black state. That experiment is shaped by white priorities, by missionary agendas, by American foreign policy, not by the full vision Cuffee had. The potential wealth of thousands of black emigrants building cross-Atlantic businesses never materializes. And back in the United States, black people remain trapped in an economy that profits from their labor, but denies them ownership of capital. Fast forward to Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 31, 1921. The Greenwood District, also known as Black Wall Street. 35 city blocks of black-owned businesses, banks, hotels, theaters, doctors' offices, grocery stores. 300 black residents murdered by a white mob. 1,256 homes burned. Property damage estimated at more than $32 million in today's money, and almost no insurance payouts. Courts deny claims. Governments look the other way. That is one city, one massacre. Now layer that on top of Rosewood, Florida in 1923, Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. Dozens of smaller riots, lynchings, arson attacks that never even made it into textbooks. Every one of them a wealth transfer. From black families who built something to white families who either directly looted or simply stepped into the economic space left behind. Now link that to Cuffee, because what you see is the same principle repeated. When black people build wealth inside America, burn it. When black people try to build wealth outside America, block it. When they build ships, seize them. When they sell stock, charge them with fraud. When they build neighborhoods, call out the mob. When they organize globally, label them foreign agents. In each case, the end result is less black wealth, less black power, more black dependency. And then, generations later, people point to the lack of wealth and blame culture. So when someone says reparations is just about slavery, you know that is too small. Slavery is the foundation. But the theft continued long after 1865. It continued when they burned Black Wall Street in 1921. It continued when they redlined black neighborhoods in the 1930s, drawing maps that blocked black families from getting federal home loans, while white families bought houses that quadrupled in value. It continued when they destroyed black business districts with highways in the 1950s and 1960s, using the words urban renewal as a polite mask for black removal. And it continued when they erased Paul Cuffee, Marcus Garvey, and other Pan-Africanists from school books, so you would think black people never had large-scale economic visions. If Paul Cuffee's model had been allowed to grow, if Garvey's Black Star Line had been allowed to mature instead of being strangled in its infancy, if Du Bois's Pan-African Congresses had been allowed to shape policy without being smeared as subversive, you would almost certainly live in a different world. The global black community would have more land, more capital, more institutions under its own control. The current racial wealth gap is not an accident. It is the accumulated result of every ship seized, every leader exiled, every neighborhood burned, every policy written with a smiling face and a racist spine. So where does that leave you? It leaves you with a choice. You can look at this pattern and feel only anger, or you can look at it and also see something else. The fact that despite all of this, Black people are still here, still building, still dreaming. The fact that the ideas they tried to kill keep coming back in new forms. Paul Cuffee dreamed of Black-controlled trade across the Atlantic. Today, you have Black entrepreneurs building digital businesses that cross borders the way his ships crossed oceans. Marcus Garvey dreamed of connecting the diaspora. Today, you can connect to someone in Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, or Brazil in seconds. Du Bois dreamed of a global Black consciousness. Today, you can learn African history, Caribbean history, Black European history with a few searches and clicks. But that digital power does not erase the economic damage. It does not restore what was stolen. That is where reparations come in. And this is where Paul Cuffee's story becomes more than inspiration. It becomes evidence. It shows intent. Reparations is not a handout. It is not charity. It is a debt. Not only for unpaid slave labor, but for every deliberate act that blocked Black attempts at self-reliance afterward. When the United States government seized Paul Cuffee's cargo in 1812 under the Nonintercourse Act, it committed an economic attack against a Black-owned business that was building an escape route from oppression. When it allowed white mobs to destroy places like Greenwood without intervening, it committed an economic attack. When it redlined, it committed an economic attack. Each of those attacks has compound interest. You do not need exact dollar amounts to understand the scale. Imagine every Black business destroyed, every property devalued, every opportunity blocked. Multiply it over 2 centuries. Factor in what that capital could have become if invested, reinvested, passed down. That is why people talk about trillions, not millions, not billions, trillions. That is why, when you hear someone say, "Get over it," you know they are either ignorant or invested in the lie. Because you cannot get over theft that is still impacting your life right now. Before we pivot fully into empowerment, into what you can do with this knowledge, pause for a moment. Let this sink in. Your ancestors were not just victims of slavery. They were visionaries whose visions were systematically attacked. They were business owners whose businesses were deliberately destroyed. They were investors whose investments were blocked and seized. They were organizers whose organizations were infiltrated and criminalized. They tried over and over to build alternative futures, and the system responded over and over with violence, law, and silence. If this truth is hitting you in your chest right now, do something with it. If you are feeling that mix of anger and clarity, that sense of finally seeing the pattern behind so many disconnected stories, pause this for a second after I finish this thought and mark that moment. When this video is done, go to the comments and write the word truth. Not as some empty gesture, but as a declaration. Truth. I see it. I accept it. I will not go back to sleep. Hit the like button if you are done with the lies. If you know at least one person in your life who grew up believing that Black people never built anything, that we only protested and begged, share this with them. Send it to your cousin who thinks our only power is voting. Send it to your church group, your group chat. Because they buried Paul Cuffee for 200 years. The only way we reverse that is if thousands of us say his name, tell his story, and refuse to let it be erased again. Now that you have seen the pattern and felt the weight of what was stolen, we need to talk about something just as important. Who you are in light of this. Because if you walk away from this with only anger at the system and no shift in how you see yourself, they still win. They win whenever you believe the lie that you come from nothing, that your people never built anything, that poverty is your natural state. So let us flip that script. Let us look at Paul Cuffee not only as a symbol of what was done to us, but as a mirror of what is in you. You are not the descendant of anonymous slaves who did nothing but suffer. You are the descendant of a man who built a shipping empire in a world that said he should not even be able to read. You are the descendant of a people who navigated by stars across dark oceans before GPS, who read winds and tides like language, who turned a small wooden boat into a fleet. You are the descendant of a man who walked into the White House in 1812, when black bodies were still being bought and sold in markets, and demanded his property back from the President of the United States. You are the descendant of families who were brave enough to step onto the Traveler in December 1815, to leave the only country they had ever known because they believed in a future they had never seen. Your poverty is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of theft. Your lack of inheritance is not because your grandparents and great-grandparents did not work hard enough. It is because every time they built something that could have become an inheritance, the system attacked. They saved. They bought property. They opened stores. They took in boarders. They ran barber shops, beauty salons, funeral homes, juke joints, churches. They built towns. In some cases, entire towns like Seneca Village in New York wiped out to build Central Park. And then, when all that was taken, they had to start over, again and again. Instead of seeing yourself as a survivor of random misfortune, see yourself as a survivor of targeted warfare, economic warfare, psychological warfare, spiritual warfare. And once you see that, something changes. Victims ask, why is this happening to me? Survivors ask, what am I going to do now that I know what this is? Descendants of victims carry shame. Descendants of warriors carry assignment. When you remember Paul Cuffee, remember his courage, but also remember his clarity. He did not wait for a fair system. He did not wait for a perfect ally. He did not wait for laws to change. He looked at the reality in front of him and asked, what can I build that they cannot control? For him, it was ships and trade routes. For you, it might be property. It might be a digital business. It might be a cooperative with friends where you pool money to buy land. It might be connecting with people on the continent to create joint ventures. And do not miss this. Paul Cuffee did all of this as a man of faith. He was a Quaker. He believed that God speaks to every soul, that the light of God shines in every person, that there is no partiality in heaven. His movements were not just business plans. They were acts of worship. He saw freeing his people and building a black-controlled economy as obedience to God. You do not have to be a Quaker to understand that. In the Black Church, we have always known that faith without works is dead. We shout about Moses leading people out of Egypt. We shout about the Exodus. We shout about promised land. Paul Cuffee was living that same story. Egypt was America. The Red Sea was the Atlantic Ocean. The promised land was Sierra Leone. So when you think about your faith, think about it the way he did, not just as comfort in suffering, but as fuel for action. God did not preserve your ancestors through the Middle Passage, slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration, just so you could survive and die quietly. Preservation always implies purpose. The fact that you are alive, listening to this, means you are part of that purpose. Maybe your role is to tell the stories that were buried. Maybe it is to organize in your city. Maybe it is to build something that will outlast you. In a few minutes, we are going to close with prayer. We are going to speak directly to that God who kept Paul Cuffee afloat in 1815 when waves crashed over the Traveler. We are going to ask for strength and clarity and courage. But before we do that, there is one more step. You need to make a decision about what you will do with this truth. Truth by itself does not set you free. It is truth you accept and act on that changes anything. If you have made it this far, your attention is not an accident. You could be watching anything else right now. You could be numbing out to entertainment. But you chose to sit with this hard history. That says something about you. So here is what I am asking. Do not let this be a one-time experience. Become a keeper of this story. Tell your children about Paul Cuffee before a textbook tells them about the American Colonization Society. Tell your grandchildren. Tell your Sunday school class. Share this video not just as content, but as curriculum. Subscribe to this channel because there are hundreds more stories like this. Stories of black millionaires buried under dust. Stories of revolts that succeeded but were brushed aside. Stories of courts we actually won that prove we were not always powerless. If you want to rebuild what was broken, you need all those pieces. You need to know you come from a line of builders, not beggars. Hit that subscribe button as a way of saying, I am in this for the long haul. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next blueprint that was stolen. Most importantly, decide that the erasure stops with you. They erased Paul Cuffee for 200 years. Do not let them erase him for another day in your house. Say his name, tell his story, and when someone tries to gaslight you about why things are the way they are, you will have receipts. You will have examples. You will have a framework. You will be able to say, no, this did not just happen. It was done. And if it was done, it can be addressed. Now let us pray. Father God, thank you for every ancestor who refused to bow to the lie that they were less than. Thank you for preserving the life and story of Paul Cuffee through centuries of silence. Thank you for the 38 souls who trusted you enough to step onto that ship in 1815 and sail toward a land they had never seen. Thank you for the strength you gave them, for the strength you gave Marcus Garvey, for the strength you gave W.E.B. Du Bois, and so many others, whose names we do not even know. Lord, we bring before you the weight of what was stolen, the wealth taken from our families, the opportunities blocked, the movements sabotaged, the neighborhoods burned, the stories buried. We ask you to see it, to remember it, to reckon with it. We ask you for justice, real justice, not just apology, not just words. Justice that restores what was taken. Justice that closes the wealth gap that policies created. Justice that honors the labor and genius of our ancestors. We ask for wisdom. Wisdom to know what to build in this generation. Wisdom to see where you are opening doors that no system can close. Wisdom to connect across oceans and generations the way Paul Cuffee dreamed. We ask for courage. Courage to speak truth in spaces that prefer lies. Courage to demand reparations without apology. Courage to organize, to save, to invest, to build. Even when the pattern we have seen is one of attack, bless every person hearing this. Heal the places where shame has taken root. Replace it with pride in the warriors they come from. Replace it with a sense of mission. Remind them that they are not accidents. They are survivors with assignment. Vindicate the memory of Paul Cuffee and every leader who paid a price for loving our people. Let their names be spoken in our homes, our churches, our schools. Most of all, God, do not let us go back to sleep. Keep this truth burning in our hearts. Let it shape how we vote, how we spend, how we teach, how we love our children. Give us the courage to demand what is ours and the grace to build something that honors you and honors them. In the name of Jesus, amen. Walk in truth. Demand justice. Reclaim your inheritance. This is Dark History Stories. Until next time, build wealth, connect across the diaspora, and remember the theft. And remember this too. They can bury a story. They can burn a neighborhood. They can seize a ship. But they cannot break a people who know who they are. You are that people.